Now this is another interesting meal that my father sent me the other day, because I think it shows how strangely we classify food. This was a restaurant meal with 2 large pork schnitzels. One came with hunter sauce and the other one with creamy mushroom sauce. And there was also a large portion of pan-fried potatoes on the side. And I think that most of us would probably describe this as a proper traditional meal. It comes from a restaurant, it is served on a ceramic plate, and it contains recognizable ingredients, such as pork, potatoes, and mushrooms. So nobody reacts to it the same way they would react to a Big Mac. But nutritionally, this meal may actually be considerably worse. You have 2 large pieces of pork covered in breadcrumbs and fried in fat. The potatoes have also been fried. And both sauces probably contain additional fat, salt, stock, cream, butter, gravy powder, or some kind of concentrated commercial base, which is very common in restaurants these days because people have become so accustomed to that very specific concentrated savory flavor. And every part of the meal has essentially been seasoned separately. So the salt is not only sitting on top where you can see it, it is inside the meat, inside the breadcrumbs coating, inside the potatoes, and dissolved throughout both sauces. And based on the size of the portion and typically restaurant preparation, this plate could plausibly contain around 1,600 to 2,200 calories. Perhaps 90 to 130 grams of fat, and possibly 8 to 10 grams of salt, which is equivalent to about 3,200 to 4,000 milligrams of sodium. We obviously cannot calculate it precisely from a photograph, because we do not know the exact weight, how much oil was used, or how the sauces were prepared. But it is clearly an enormous meal. Now I want to compare this with a Big Mac and a large portion of fries, because then it becomes more obvious. A Big Mac with fries is obviously not something you would consider healthy, but you would immediately recognize it as junk food. Together, however, the burger and fries contain around 1,000 calories, approximately about 51 grams of fat and just over 3 grams of salt, which is equivalent to roughly 1,200 milligrams of sodium. So the meal that nearly everybody would immediately call junk food contains far fewer calories, much less fat, and perhaps only 1/3 of the salt contained in this traditional restaurant plate. And that is honestly quite absurd. Because nobody needs to be taught that McDonald's is fast food. Because the burger comes in cardboard, the fries come in paper packaging, and the entire presentation tells you that this is something highly processed and probably not an everyday meal. But put 2 pork schnitzels, pan-fried potatoes, and 2 heavy sauces on a ceramic plate, and suddenly the meal becomes respectable. Many people would probably even describe it as real food because it contains pork, potatoes, and mushrooms. But those ingredients could have been prepared very differently. You could simply eat a piece of pork with boiled potatoes and cooked mushrooms. But here in this example, every ingredient has been turned into something much heavier. The pork is coated in breadcrumbs and fried. The mushrooms are turned into concentrated sauces. And the potatoes become a large fried side dish. And because the processing happened inside a restaurant kitchen rather than inside a food factory, we somehow stopped recognizing it as processing. We start calling it traditional and saying that our grandmothers prepared meals like this. But my grandmother told me that when she was younger, they had very limited access to salt, and cooking fat was also used sparingly because it was expensive and had to last. So yes, they may have eaten pork, potatoes and mushrooms, but not necessarily in this heavily salted, fried and sauce form. That does not automatically make this enormous modern restaurant version traditional. 2 giant pork schnitzels, 2 separate sauces, concentrated stock, commercial seasoning, and a mountain of pan-fried potatoes may have very little to do with the meal people remember from home. And then there's also a strange difference in transparency. McDonald's publishes the nutritional information. You can look up the calories, fat and salt before you order. But this restaurant meal, you receive nothing. You do not know how much salt was used, how much frying fat the breadcrumbs coating absorbed, or whether the sauces were prepared with cream, butter, stock powder, or a ready-made commercial base. You simply assume that the meal must be more wholesome because it came from a traditional restaurant rather than from a fast food chain. And that assumption may be completely wrong, because this comparison clearly shows that many meals presented as proper restaurant food belong in exactly the same junk food category. And some of them may even be far more extreme than the fast food everybody immediately recognizes. Your body does not know whether the meal arrived in cardboard or on a ceramic plate. It does not know whether the sauce was called burger sauce, hunter sauce, or creamy mushroom sauce. It only receives what was actually in the meal. But apparently, junk food stops being junk food when you give it a traditional name and serve it on a ceramic plate. So I hope this gives you some food for thought. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!